I'm part of Briar Hill, but we're actually on Xavier School. But our house and the house next to us is not that blue house. Yeah, and then so. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. You ready to start? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I am really glad you all were here because 5 minutes ago there wasn't anybody here, and you know, and you just, but when you're sitting here waiting for everybody, it's just really lonely. It's sort of very similar to my experience when I came here at 9:45, and I'm like, where is everybody? Oh, they'll show up, and I'm thinking they're going to show up at 10, and it's like 10 after. It's like, what's everybody doing? And then finally Mary Jo goes, no, we don't start till 10:30. So I'm going to begin us with a prayer and then begin us. Gracious and holy God, we ask now in this time that you would be with us as we talk about mental health, but also spiritual health. And as we open up to you and open up to just gaining knowledge that helps us to live life in more generous and better ways. And Lord, we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. So back, I guess when Susan and I talked about my coming here and giving a talk, Susan had said, I said, well, what would you like me to talk about? And Susan said, well, what if you talked about mental health and teen mental health and things like that? And I thought about that, but as I said to her, I'm the executive director of a counseling agency. I'm not working with kids. I haven't worked as a counselor with kids since 1984. And I said, it might be better to get one of the other therapists. And she said, yeah, but they're not going to preach. And I said, okay, well, I get that point. But then I realized, I certainly can talk about teen mental health and things like that. By the way, I'm going to make a pitch for you if you're interested in this. Remember this, SamaritanCounseling.net. We are having on Thursday, October 12th, we are having our gala, our annual gala, where we're a nonprofit, so we need to raise about $30,000 a year that goes to client aid, because we see clients regardless of whether they have insurance or not, regardless of what a lot of the people who use our client aid are people who either don't have insurance, although with the Affordable Care Act, there aren't very many people like that. Many come to us and have a $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 deductible, and so we help them. Or periodically, you just get someone who is in an abusive situation and can't use the insurance because it will alert the abusive person in the household. We are doing a gala on Thursday, October 12th at Lamont Restaurant. Our MC is Larry Richard. If you KDK radio or you listen to Pitt football games, and Larry is kind of all over the place. We are actually having one of our board members, Dr. Michael Lawhead, who's the superintendent of the Hampton School District and a licensed psychologist who's also a therapist. He is going to talk about teen mental health and all of that. So, but this is, I would encourage you to go on our website, SamaritanCounseling.net, and consider coming to our gala and learning more about Samaritan and being part of the Samaritan constellation. At any rate, when I was asked by Susan, I thought, what I'd really rather talk about is what makes Samaritan unique. Samaritan is one of the best counseling centers in the Pittsburgh area. It is a reason I was willing to leave my church after 22 years to become the executive director there. It's the primary place, that and Anchor Point Counseling, which is in North Hills, were the two counseling centers I was referring most of the people I knew for counseling, because the quality of therapy and therapists is actually higher than most for-profit. We are accredited every 4 years, and it's an incredibly stringent accreditation with the Solighton Institute. The level that they expect us is way higher than most other counseling centers. All of our therapists are licensed therapists. They're all masters or higher level therapists. And I will share with you a comment that was made to me last week. We have a master's in social work intern or field placement student at Samaritan. And last week during our supervision, she said to me, "Hey, Graham, I want to share something with you that, well, you know, when I interviewed here, you told me how great Samaritan was and how much it is, how really good it is compared to other places." And she said, "I just figured you said that because you're the executive director and you have to say that." She said, "I've already sat in on, we do a spiritual integration group one Friday a month where we talk to the therapist about how to integrate spirituality into their therapy. And then we also do case conferences." And she said, "The breadth and depth of the therapists you have here," she said, "I've been around other counseling centers." She said, "It's amazing, but what's even more amazing is how much everybody wants to help each other. How much when someone has an issue, they not only go to Susan, who's our clinical director, but also go to each other for help." And she said, "I've only been here for 3 weeks, but she said, this has been a really amazing place." We're not very good at self-promoting. We really aren't, because our focus is the work, and we're not there for profit. So the focus isn't on how does Graham make a lot of money. We really are about the service. But the thing we do uniquely is we integrate spirituality into therapy. That does not mean we force spirituality into therapy. If you come to Samaritan and you are a conservative Catholic, a progressive Protestant, a moderate non-denominational, if you are gay or lesbian or transgendered, if you're old or young or middle-aged, we treat you as you are. We do not proselytize. We do not try to convert. We treat people as you are with the issue that you bring to us. And if you're an atheist or an agnostic and say, "I don't want to bring spirituality into it," we don't, because as I said, all of our therapists are licensed. But if you are someone who is conservative, progressive, moderate, Catholic, Protestant, Greek Orthodox, non-denominational, we find ways to integrate spirituality that's coherent with whatever your tradition is. We do not try to make you something you aren't, but instead use that resource you already have. And so that's why I basically said to Susan, I'd much rather talk about the connection between spiritual and mental health rather than just talking about teen. You can go online and read 1 million articles on teen mental health. There are a lot of places that talk about how we're spirit, mind, and body, but they're not. You know, basically what they'll say is, well, do mindfulness or do meditation. We do a lot more. So I want to start with sharing a spiritual experience with a client that I had, or a patient I had back in 1982. And this really, it sparks my interest in the connection between spirituality and therapy. I was working in a psychiatric hospital in Virginia. I was a therapist. I was working with adolescents and children. And I was a primary therapist for one of the patients who was a 16-year-old kid, had come in, bipolar. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit. He was bipolar, and he was in a manic phase where he was having a lot of self-delusions, et cetera. And I was meeting with him 5 days a week, but he was really not getting better. And we had our consultations with the psychiatrist, the nurses, the therapist. And what we agreed was if he didn't get better in the next 2 weeks, we had no choice but to send him to a long-term state-run facility. So at any rate, I was working with him, and I don't know that I felt like our therapy sessions were that productive. He was really challenging for me. But I did notice over the course of a couple sessions, he seemed a little bit clearer. And one day I came in for a session, and we would meet in his room. And I sat down and asked him how things were going, and he said, well, I want to share something with you. Something happened last week that I've shared it with the psychiatrist, and I've shared it with others, and they've just told me it's part of my illness. And he said, Graham, I'd like to share it with you, but I'm worried you're going to say the same thing. And I just said, well, okay, well, share your experience and we'll see. And he said, I saw Jesus in the window last week. Now, I have to tell you, you heard me say this when I was up there. I walked away from the church when I was 15. By the way, this experience was something that helped me to eventually want to get my master's in social work at Pitt and my master's in divinity at Pittsburgh Seminary so I could learn how to deal with this person who just saw Jesus in the window, but I had never been trained to do that. Plus, I hadn't been to church in like 5 years, so, I'm not even sure what I thought about Jesus. And I'm looking at him going, well, my training tells me I'm supposed to tell you this is part of your illness. But I just sort of promised that I wouldn't. So I just said, well, okay, what was Jesus doing? And he said, well, it was weird because he said it was real. It wasn't just a vision, but he was really there. And he said he was standing on a path, and the path forked behind him. And he said on the right path were all these derelict Skid Row drunks. And he said on the left path were all these successful people. And I fleshed out more details trying to figure out I was trying to buy time because I had no idea what to say to him. Because, that doesn't come up in your counseling training. And I finally said, so what do you think Jesus is telling you? And he said, I think Jesus is telling me right now I need to make a decision. I can continue the way I am and I'm going to end up like those derelicts, or I can make a decision to get better and I can have a successful life. And with all of my counseling training, I said to him, yeah, I just think you ought to listen to what Jesus is telling you to do. So I came in a week later and he started getting better. Now, hear what I'm saying, because to me this is important. I'm the executive director of a counseling center. I do believe the counseling was helping him, but also the medication he was on was helping him. But also, Jesus was helping him. The next week I come in and he's smiling, and I just looked at him and I said, what's up? And he said, I just saw Jesus again. I said, when? And he said, like, last night. And I said, in the window? And he goes, well, it was weird. He said, I was in my bed, I was sitting in my bed, and he said, I was both in my bed, but I was also on a football field with him. I said, no, was this a dream? He said, no, my eyes were wide open when it happened. And he said, we were standing on a football field, and we were at the 50-yard line, and we were facing each other, and there was a chain link fence between us. And he said, I turned around and looked back, and the grass was green except from the 25-yard line through the end zone, it was dead. And I kind of looked at him and fleshed out a few more details, and I finally said, well, you know what I said, right? What did I say?
Jesus.
Yeah, what do you think Jesus is telling you? And he thought for a moment. He said, I think Jesus is telling me I've gone from death to life, but I have more obstacles to overcome in order to get to be where he is. By the way, this goes to what I preached about, this listening to spiritual experiences instead of dismissing them. And I just said, I think you ought to do what Jesus is telling you. Within 2 weeks, we dismissed him to home. Did not send him to the long-term facility. A year later, I was in a mall, and as I'm going this way, I see his father coming this way. And as a therapist, you kind of learn, you don't really talk in public spaces. He made a beeline to me and just came to me, and he said, Graham, how are you? It's so good to see you. And I said, well, what's happened with your son? He said, well, we didn't send him back to the private school he was in. We sent him back to the local public school, but you would never know he had a problem. He said he's gotten straight A's. He's about to get into what we consider the best university in Virginia. I won't tell you which one, and you might want to debate with people in Virginia which one that is, but they certainly thought that. And he said, Graham, I don't know what you did, but you all are miracle workers. Because he said, we thought our son was lost for the rest of his life, and now we're looking at him, and he is just thriving. And I thought to myself as I'm walking away, I don't know whether it was us or whether it was Jesus. The thing was, in that moment, I integrated the spiritual into the psychological. Often what happens is when people have insights like this or experiences like this, or even, whatever's going on, we don't know what to do with them. But there is so much research out there that shows that when people, even when they're struggling mentally, are involved in churches and are open spiritually, they have better outcomes than those who don't. What they've done so much research on, and it's all over the internet, is that people who live prayerful lives, who have people pray for them, who sing hymns, who pray, who do all these things, that they actually are mentally healthier than people exactly like them who don't engage in these things. I'm not saying because you sing hymns you're going to be mentally healthy. I am going to say you're going to, compared to people who don't do that, who are at the same level you are, you will be healthier to where they are. Basically, the thing that's so important to me is understanding that mental and spiritual health are linked. But in our culture, what's happened, because we don't know what to do with religion, we don't know what to do with spirituality, we have tended to separate them. So that even though you will go to a therapist who says, oh yeah, I'm open spiritually, often they do what I call Buddhism light, where we're going to teach you mindfulness and meditation, we're going to teach you breathing exercises and things like that. But often there's not an engagement in, well, what do your experiences tell you? Or there's not an engagement of how do we use your church or how do we use your participation spiritually, religiously to nurture you and support you. The reality is that mental health issues are hidden. They are hard to tell when someone has a mental health issue. But you do see them through behavior. You know, that person who's a little bit odd, or that person who gets angry all the time, or that person who struggles with drinking or with pornography, or those are called, by the way, there's two kinds of addictions. One are substance addictions, the other are process addictions. Substance addictions are things like drugs, alcohol, food, other things that you engage in. Process addictions are addictions that release chemicals in your brain by doing actions. They are things such as looking at pornography, gambling, I'm trying to think of others, shopping. It could be scanning the internet. It could be watching Fox News or MSNBC or something like that, where when you watch these things and you hear people's opinions, you not only feel angrier at the rest of the world, but you feel better about yourselves. You can still have a process addiction, which I think all of these are things that we don't pay attention to. Mental health issues are basically hidden and seen through behavior. Spiritual health issues seem hidden and often are misinterpreted as mental health issues. Actually, up until about 25 years ago, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, actually had sections in there that saw religion as indications of mental difficulties. That's all changed, but the thing I want you to be aware of how much they're linked, many of the mental health approaches and interventions actually started out as spiritual approaches that were stripped of the spiritual and redefined psychologically. I'm going to give you may not know what these things are, but how many of you have ever heard of Rogerian therapy? You got a few. Rogerian is the most basic therapy. Linda, since I know you and I get to practice some Rogerian therapy right here. Yeah, it's going to be really simple. Make up a problem and tell me your problem. This is Rogerian therapy.
Let's see. I have a friend that I thought we were really close, and as it turns out, she's always angry at me, and she puts me in a corner, and she goes out with other people that we used to go out with, all of us, and now she doesn't do that anymore.
So you have a friend who's just always angry at you, and and it feels like you've been abandoned by her. Yeah, go ahead, keep going.
So, well, I don't know what.
Yeah, that's Rogerian therapy. I just mirrored back to her what she just said.
Yeah.
Carl Rogers, who started that therapy, not only grew up in the church, but he ended up going to seminary where he was studying to be a pastor and learned pastoral care. This Rogerian therapy method is something that's been done in the Christian world since Jesus. They've done it in monasteries, except what he did was he took it and turned it into, they refined it, they sharpened the tools, but it really is very much what has been going on in monasteries and pastors have been doing for millennia. Meditation and mindfulness. The meditation and mindfulness that often therapists teach comes out of Buddhism, and we have similar things in Christianity. We call it by different terms. Meditation is what we call contemplation. It's sitting in silence and breathing. Mindfulness is what we call living in the present moment and being aware of everything. But this is stuff that they've pulled out of religion, and they've just sort of excised God out of it. I'm going to teach you mindfulness meditation techniques to get you calmer, to get you more relaxed. But what they do is they strip the divine out, they strip God out. Acceptance and commitment therapy. This is not real new, but relatively new therapy that's about learning to accept people are and to live in commitment to yourself and to others. Well, what does that sound like? Christianity. Accepting people as they are, which we may not always do, but accepting people as they are and learning to follow through with commitments. It's a therapy called radical forgiveness. How do I learn to radically forgive myself and to forgive others? Well, does that remind you of anything? Like Sermon on the Mount stuff? Discernment therapy, which is how do you pay attention to something, your deeper self, your true self? Well, that's really coming out of the Christian understanding of listening to God who's in and through us. Addiction recovery, the 12 steps. Most people don't know, but where the 12 steps started was here in Pittsburgh. Now, it wasn't called the 12 steps, but it started at Calvary Episcopal Church. William Shoemaker was the pastor there, and he had started a movement. I think they called it the Oxford Movement. I'm not sure exactly I don't know if it was the Oxford Movement or something else. But anyway, they started it there. Bill W., who wrote the big book, he was actually, it wasn't a member of Calvary, but William Shoemaker started it there, began to do groups based on these steps of repentance. And then he moved to New York City, and Bill W. became part of that church in New York City and became part of this, and he adapted the 12 steps to him. So you are seeing right there and then how much spirituality is integrated into the therapy movement. But what's happened is therapy has tended to strip out the spiritual. And what we've tended to do is to try to reintegrate it, not force it, but reintegrate it. So I do want to now shift. I want to help you understand first what are mental health issues, what are the basic mental health issues, and then from there talk about spiritual health. So the basic mental health issues, there are 3 categories. There are more than this, but this is for you to easily understand mental health issues, because I think mental health is kind of confusing a bit, right? Like, what is it? Okay, so there are psychiatric, what we might call psychiatric organic disorders. These are disorders that have a brain-body chemical imbalance and can be treated with therapy and medication. Can you think of what they might be? Depression is one, yeah. When people say, well, just snap out of it, well, you can't. It's because the chemistry of your brain is off. So when you take Zoloft or one of the other things, what that's doing is it's introducing chemicals into your body that get into the brain and help balance it. It doesn't take away depression, but the reason why Zoloft is called that is because it sort of sounds like so lofty. I've been brought up. It takes away the depths of the depression. Can you think of others that might be this psychiatric and organic? What's that? ADHD, yeah, that's something where you can, it's actually both life issues and that, but yeah, you can take medication for it. Anti-anxieties, Ritalin, depending on what your age is. The ADD doesn't really work as well with medication, but the ADHD, adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is that, whereas as opposed to attention deficit disorder. Can you think of others? What's that? Yeah, bipolar. You take lithium. It balances the neurotransmitters in your brain to allow better messaging to go through. The problem is people who have bipolar often have a hard time taking it because while they're often in manic episodes and everybody else can see how disoriented and disconnected they are, for them they feel incredibly sharp and insightful and energetic. And when you take the lithium, it actually brings them to where most of us are, more or less, but they like that high, which is why it's hard to take it. Others are obsessive compulsive disorder. There's an obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not the same thing. Obsessive compulsive disorder, if you ever saw the TV show Monk, there are medications you can take, schizophrenia, different kinds of psychosis. Those are what you would call psychiatric organic disorders, and there's something where you do need to see a therapist, but you also need to see a psychiatrist. Not just your PCP, but a psychiatrist who can take blood, who can measure the levels of medication, who keep in touch with you on that. There's a second level of disorders that are called personality disorders. And these are disorders rooted in impulsive, imbalanced, difficult personality styles that may be the result of nature. There may be a genetic component, but also nurture, your experiences growing up. They disrupt relationships, create conflict, often result in isolation and in low quality of life. These typically don't respond to medication. Sometimes anti-anxiety can help people who have borderline personality disorder, but for the most part, there aren't medications for these because these are personality styles that people have developed. The best way of explaining it is, often they are hyper-developed in one personality trait and underdeveloped in all others. It's kind of like having a toolbox. How many of you have a toolbox at home? What's in your toolbox?
Tools.
What kind of tools? Hammer? Screwdriver? Wrench? Pliers? Anything else? What? A box cutter? Yeah, you've got a lot of tools for everything. Somebody with a personality disorder, it's like they only have one or two tools in that box. They may have a screwdriver and a wrench. So when you have a screwdriver and a wrench, what happens is, as long as you're in a situation that needs a screwdriver or a wrench, you're in great shape. Once you need to hammer in a nail, it becomes a mess because you're using the screwdriver or the wrench to do it, you're hitting your hand, you're causing destruction to the wood, things like that. A lot of people with personality disorders are very talented in specific areas. For example, a lot of actors and actresses may have borderline personality disorder, which is what I believe someone like Elizabeth Taylor, who had 8 husbands, somebody who can cry like this, who can inhabit a different space from her own, but at the same time can't keep relationships because that emotional volatility is there every day. It's like, as long as I'm acting, I've got the right tool, but in a marriage, I don't. Or there's narcissistic personality disorder, which is people who are kind of so self-focused. They are great as long as everything surrounds them and they're building up organizations or corporations or things like that, but their relationships are broken all over the place. They belittle people, they make, or there's dependent personality, which is, these are people who, they don't have an identity of their own, but are, they give themselves over to other people who define them. There are other ones, schizotypal, which is what I call artist syndrome. These are people who are really fantastic at being creative artistically, but they don't get relationships. Do you remember Kramer from Seinfeld or Phoebe from Friends? I would say they show symptoms of schizotypal, where like Kramer comes up with the idea of creating a coffee table book of pictures of coffee tables that have 2 legs that turn into a coffee table. That's classic. It's they make connections. You go, how would you ever think that? But then they don't get basic relationship stuff. They miss those kind of clues. There are a bunch of others. There's histrionic personality disorder, people who live mostly in their emotions. I'm doing this off memory, so I'm not remembering all. There is an obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which looks like obsessive compulsive disorder, but these are people who tend to function better in life. A way of thinking about this is that the organic disorder is somebody who you look at and say, that person is crazy. With someone who has a personality disorder, often what happens is they make other people crazy. I don't mean that flippantly. That's actually one way of figuring out the difference between the two. Is this something where actually people are supportive and they're appreciative of it, but they can't seem to not touch doorknobs? Or is it something where they're so hoarding and obsessive compulsive that it destroys relationships and things like that? Third level of what we do are life issues such as trauma, broken relationships, life changes, vocational issues, disappointments, grief, meaning and purpose issues, consequences of poor decision making. Addictions still fall under that because a lot of time, while the disorder may be physiological, there's often not some kind of drug or something you can take to help people with these. Anything that arises out of life situations. Those are 3 levels of mental health. Any just real quick questions about that or thoughts or anything you may be thinking while I'm here, or that goes back to what I said earlier?
I'm assuming that there can be a mix of those, correct? Like
Yeah.
you can have,
Yeah, I'm making it really
you
simple.
probably also
Yeah,
have anxiety, but you can do anxiety.
that's it. You know, you can have somebody with a personality disorder, like let's say borderline, but they're also struggling with life issues. You know, they're separated from their spouse. They hate their job. They're grieving because their parents have died, or maybe suffering from an addiction. Yeah, and that's what makes counseling really complicated.
Yes, and important, I would assume to see, okay, maybe there are some medications on top of what we can do.
Yep.
In terms of like cognitive behavioral.
Yep. Right, and that's exactly what happens is, you know, especially if you have a psychiatric organic disorder, you probably want to be seeing somebody in a clinic where you're regularly seeing a psychiatrist. We have a consulting psychiatrist, but we're not a clinic, so we have a psychiatrist that we consult with over things and sits in our case conferences. So what that means is we're working more with personality disorders and life issues than we are the organic disorders. Unless where the exception is if we're working with somebody and we realize they've got an issue that is beyond us, and we work with a psychiatrist, but we don't want to transfer them to the clinic's staff because that would create disruptions in their counseling, and so that's where we sign releases and do consultations. Other thoughts about that or questions? So what are spiritual health issues? That's much harder to define. Spiritual health issues are basically, again, I'll give you 3 types. Personal communal disciplines, morality, sense of meaning, and purpose. These are things we do to become healthier. One of the things spirituality always teaches is to grow spiritually, you have to adopt a more disciplined life. You know, make time for prayer. Say grace before meals. Take time to read scripture. Make time to come to church. It's engaging in a moral way of living where this is how I will treat people. I will follow right or wrong. Also, a sense of meaning and purpose. Spiritual health is when we're living lives where we are doing things and engaging in things that make us feel like purposeful. This is what I'm here on earth to do. I mean, I feel that in my careers. I'm on earth and I feel like this is part of God's purpose for me. Meaning is when I engage in something, I feel like, yes, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. You can see how this fits over mental health. We can just deal with somebody's mental health issue, whatever it is. But when you bring the spiritual in, we can begin to talk about, okay, but can you engage in some kind of spiritual disciplines that open you up to God? Can you develop a stronger morality of this is the way you're going to treat people, and can we explore that? Can we look at, are you experiencing a sense of meaning and purpose in your life? Are you engaging in activities, or are you in a job, or are you in a career, or are you in relationships that make you feel like my life has purpose? It's one of the reasons we might say, you don't like your job, you're stuck in it, but can you go out and do something beyond your job? Engage in some service opportunity that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. When you build that on top of mental health and growth, it actually charges the mental health work that you do because it gets people outside of themselves. It gets people living a more ordered life. Another level of spiritual health is engaging in prayer, discernment, and feeling a connection with God, the Holy Divine. It is feeling a sense of connection with God because of engaging in a deeper prayer life, listening to and following God's guidance, and sensing God's presence in and throughout life. We train our therapists in this. If they're struggling with, well, how do I know if it's God or me? Well, we train our therapists to help them figure out what's you and what's God. Some of the things we talk about is if it feels like this shouting impulse, it's really driving you, that's probably not God. God tends to be more gentle. God tends to speak more in whispers and nudges. And so part of the discipline is calming yourself down enough so you can listen more to the nudge rather than, because the screaming voice often is more our limbic system, our amygdalas. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, you probably have an idea. Heard a term 2 months ago that I now use all the time. I read an article that said one of the problems of American life is that we are living in a time of limbic capitalism. The question is, do you know what the limbic system is? It's a part right on either side, right here. It has your amygdala, your pituitary gland, your hypothalamus. It's the emotional center. Most people think that we're rational. What we really are is emotional with periodic moments of lucidity. The last part to develop is our frontal lobes. It's the reason why when you're really trying to think, if you ever notice, you go like this and you rub your forehead, so you're massaging your frontal lobes because you're trying to actually help this part get over this part. Limbic capitalism is we live in a time where people are making billions of dollars to get you to not think, but instead to get you to be impulsive. Watch cable news. Read inflammatory articles about how the world is falling apart and it's all this person's fault. It is sports. It's sports betting. It is, you walk into a supermarket, putting things there that you feel like you can't resist putting into your shopping cart. You go to Michael's and you have to walk a gauntlet with your kids through candy. Mom, dad, and it's like, no, you have to learn to say no, no, no. We live, music, entertainment, all of it is geared on the limbic system. A lot of spiritual health is getting us to move outside of it and to develop a greater transcendence where we're listening to what God wants for us instead. Final category is spiritually transforming experiences, which is experiences that change our lives for the better. I just talked about them. I don't have to go over them again, but unexplained incidences, coincidences, healings, direct God experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, a sense of transcendence. That when you bring these over top of mental health counseling, when people are open to it, it makes a difference at how transforming people are. They become healthier. As I said, if you come in and say, I don't really want to bring the spiritual in, our therapists don't. But, our clinical director and I did a 4-hour training that the Pitt School of Social Work sponsored for CEUs, where we did 4 hours of training therapists. How do you integrate the spiritual in? We do a monthly group that's also sponsored by Pitt School of Social Work. We do it for us and Anchor Point Counseling, where any of their therapists who are our therapists who are part of it, for each hour you do, you get a CEU credit. To be licensed, you need every 2 years to get 30 hours of CEU training. You do the group with us for 1 year, you're 1/3 of the way. If you do it for 2 years, you're 2/3 of the way, and then you don't really have to go find a whole lot else. The key is how do we actually bring the spiritual in a world where what's happened is we've disconnected the spiritual from the mental health. In fact, part of what I preached about today is we've kind of disconnected the spiritual sometimes from church because we don't talk about these spiritual things. We talk about theological things. We talk about ethics. We talk about morality. We talk about what we should do, what we ought to do. We engage in mission. We do a lot of good things. But often, we don't talk about experiences of God. We don't share them. And yet these are things that actually bring about greater mental health. So I'm getting close to ending. So just a few more. So what is the connection between, well, let me ask other questions before I move on. Sorry about that. I'm like going on a train and I keep forgetting to stop it. Yeah.
I'm just curious, I know you might be touching on this, you talked about hiring a mental health or a spiritual director.
Yes.
Possibly adding a spiritual. Does that person then work with people of different faiths too? Or is that
Yes. So yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually a trained spiritual director. My PhD is in spiritual formation. So in addition to having a master's in social work, I'm a spiritual director. The work I do actually is I do spiritual direction, but I do spiritual direction and coaching almost entirely with pastors. I have about 30-something pastors that I work with. About half are locally, the rest are across the country and some internationally. I work with them on how do you turn around your churches? How do you open up to the spiritual? How do you create a church that is more open? Because it's stuff we did at Calvin Church. I think you actually even know Ralph Lowe, is he the one who works with you guys? Ralph's my best friend, and Ralph also was an elder at Calvin Church, and so Ralph is fully, embraces this stuff, and Ralph is, but it's I work with people to open them up to God, but also to create healthier ways of leading. We also have hired Amy Armenius, who has both Presbyterian and Greek Orthodox background, and a couple years ago graduated from the Pneuma Institute, which is a spiritual direction training program. And so I work with the clergy. She tends to work with lay people who just want to grow spiritually. And spiritual direction, a way of thinking of it, it's not counseling. It is focused on the relationship between you and God. What's getting in the way? What would help nurture it? What would help make it better? The thing that's great about having her work with us is it means if she has someone she suspects has mental health issues, she's allowed to, she can continue working with this client, but can also refer the person for counseling, and vice versa. I've had our therapists refer people to me who they kind of feel like, the spiritual is beyond me, and they're asking spiritual questions, and so we'll work in tandem with each other. We also have a life coach, Rachel Fagan, and a life coach is not a spiritual director, not a therapist, but somebody who works with you. The way she articulates, the great way of saying it, therapy is to get people from floundering to functioning. Coaching is to get people from functioning to flourishing. And that's what her role is. And she has a number of clients who are also clients with our therapist. The difference is when you come to us for counseling, your insurance pays, except your copay, the insurance pays for your counseling. People have to self-pay for spiritual direction and coaching, but that tends to be more like once a month or once every 2 weeks, something like that. Is that way more than you needed? Yeah. But that's part of what we are doing is we're trying to actually broaden up, and even for time we've consulted with nutritionists and things like that. We're trying to be spirit, mind, and body. Despite everyone saying they are, we actually try to train them for it. Any other questions or thoughts? So finally, spirituality. So what is the connection between spiritual and mental health? The reality is people who are struggling psychologically will also struggle to grow spiritually. You can't disconnect them because your mind is part of it. And vice versa. People who struggle spiritually will also tend to struggle more with mental health issues, not necessarily ones that lead to dysfunction, but the reality is so much research showed if you're spiritually open, your relationships will be better, your feelings about yourself will be better, etc. Spirituality is ultimately about relationships between us and God and us and each other. People grow spiritually, they feel God more in their lives, they tend to be more loving and caring. So mental health orders that disrupt relationships impact spirituality. If you are living in a dysfunctional situation, it is very hard to be open spiritually. If you are living in a manipulative, abusive situation, it is very hard for people like that, until they get out of it and move into a safe place, for them to actually open up spiritually. I will say also sometimes the Bible and religion are used as abusers. I gave a talk years ago to a women's shelter in the North Hills specifically about proper uses of the Bible, because so many of them have been told, the Bible says you are to be submissive to me, and that I am the head of the family. So all the things I do, I really only do to help you. I do these things because I love you. And so I came in and said, they're full of crap. What they're saying is manipulative, it's abusive. That's not what it meant. That actually the other part was, you're also supposed to cherish people. The husbands are supposed to cherish their wives. And so to just make one half of it, but I said that also reflects a culture that was 2,000 years ago. It didn't have the insights that we have now. Spiritual approaches that enhance relationships, that talk about commitment, love, etc., they help mental health. Also, spirituality is always transformative. So mental health issues that resist ongoing growth impact the spiritual. If you've got a mental health issue where it's really hard for you to try to grow in life, then you're probably going to have a hard time opening up spiritually because you're not going to grow in that way. But also ongoing spiritual health. Praying, coming to church, studying the Bible, listening to different perspectives, that's stuff that also opens people up to mental health healing. Spirituality also opens us up to guidance and wisdom. While mental health issues can close us and isolate us and cause us to think and act in disordered ways, spiritual openness can help us trust others and to guide us and seek wisdom, balance, and more. A large part of spirituality is seeking wisdom. Is how do we live a life that's grounded in something more than just typical human living? If you're in a disrupted life, it's hard for you often to make wise choices. But opening up to the spiritual actually nurtures spirituality in you. So I'm going to give you just final, these are final things that nurture spirituality and mental health. Cultivating a sense of awe. Ooh, I left something out. Cultivating a sense of awe. Do you know what awe is?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a Japanese, I can't remember what it's called, like sungi or something, forest bathing. Have anybody ever heard of forest bathing? You go into the forest and you just live there. It creates awe. You go to the beach, awe. You go to the mountains, awe. You watch Pitt win a national championship, awe. It's awe is this sense of, the word itself comes from, I can't say anything but the more we cultivate awe, the more that helps us mentally. Gratitude, I didn't put that up there, but one of the things I teach people to do is, you're seeing everything that's wrong. Look around and look for what's right. Now, I will tell you, this has impact on the Steelers. Quit looking for what's wrong, look for what's right. Enjoy the entertainment as opposed to obsessing about it. Because we have a culture where people take everything for granted. Living in the present moment and mindfulness. Yeah, you have a past and the past bothers you, and you're worried about the future, but live in the now. Open up to how God and people are here now. Acceptance. I don't mean acceptance of abuse, but acceptance of where your life is and learning to find good in it rather than what you didn't accomplish or where you didn't succeed or how much of a failure you are. Learning to accept where you are and making that your starting point. Living a sense of balance. A balance between this and that, because we do not live balanced lives. A sense of humility. Not a dog-beaten, I'm low and bad. Humility at its core, the Latin root is humus. You know what humus means? What?
I used to know.
Well, it's not hummus, which is in your refrigerator, but humus is when you garden, you dig up humus. It's dirt. Humus is coming out of that creation story of living in recognition that I'm human. That, I'm from dirt and I'll go back to dirt. Actually, it's interesting. Human comes from humus. Humility comes from humus. So does humor. Have you ever noticed the things that are funny? What are the things that are really funny? Actually, my daughters are Gen Z, or they're sort of between millennials and Gen Z. I found out that whole generation is obsessed with poop, farts, burps. It's because it's grounding, it's human, it's funny. I don't know why, because I get tired of that humor. They get tired of dad jokes. It's life. If you look at most really funny, like Seinfeld, why is it? Seinfeld deals with basic, stupid human tendencies. That's what makes it funny. Compassion is something else that nurtures us mental health-wise. Living in community, being connected with people that you normally wouldn't associate with. We tend to striate in terms of socioeconomic, generations. Look around here right now. You're sitting here with people you normally wouldn't. And you're somewhat engaging. Not necessarily really engaging, but you're somewhat engaging. Study, reflection on my life, living in faith, trust, serving others. Can you think of any other things that kind of nurture the spiritual life that also enhance mental health? That cover all of them?
Nature, I think it kind of,
Yeah, walking. I often tell people, if you're having problems, you don't have to sit there and try to do contemplative prayer for 45 minutes. Take a 45-minute walk and use that as prayer. But do it somewhere where there's nature, because that's Monique and I see each other walking, because I walk through her neighborhood a lot because there's just huge oak trees. And there's, as we're both hitting the point where we're going to have to start raking them up soon. And oak leaves are terrible because they don't biodegrade, they don't go away, and they're really heavy. But before then, they're really nice. We're now in acorn season. So when I walk by Monique's house, it's like crunch, crunch, crunch. It's like pop all the acorns. But that's, walking in nature. Can you think of anything else? Music, yeah. What? Hobbies, yeah, depending what I think it's one of the reasons why men fish and hunt. It's really to get out in nature. It gives you something to do, because I've talked to so many men who have said to me, over time, I quit shooting at the deer, and I quit actually caring whether I catch a fish. It's more being out there. And music, too. Music is something that just kind of, listening to music can center us and nurture us. All of these things nurture mental health. I think it's one of the reasons why today I kind of resisted just talking about mental health, because I realized we actually don't make the connection. And part of the problem of our culture is we've cut the spiritual off so much that what's happened is, in the counseling world, they take the spiritual and they strip off the spiritual part and keep the practices. But actually, if you're keeping what happens in these practices there, it nurtures mental health and actually makes people healthier. So questions or thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just looking at the list and thinking about, how about forgiveness?
Forgiveness? Yeah, there's a million things. Trying to think of this like yesterday afternoon as I'm getting ready to go to the Pitt football game was not like, it's like, come on, there's more there. Yeah. But yeah, forgiveness, not holding on to people's pains. And showed you there's a therapy that's around that called radical forgiveness, where they try to teach you how to forgive, although they do cut the God part out of it. They would not say we cut the God part out of it. We just don't make it like you have to have God in there. Although, have any of you ever read or heard the book The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom? It's an amazing book, and she at the end of the book forgives the most brutal guard in the concentration camp. And she had an experience where basically she said, I can't do it. God, you have to do it through me. And she had an experience where she felt something pull her arm up and shake the guy's hand, and just like electricity just went right through it. And, that's that forgiveness. And she went through trauma. And, she came out of the trauma of the concentration camps and first went to Germany to preach forgiveness to the German people, and then preached forgiveness across the world for the last years of her life. Any other questions or thoughts about any of this?
I was just thinking, community covers this, but just friendship. Just the idea
Yeah.
of having at least one person who you know well enough who will ask you, how are you doing today?
Yeah.
And really care about the answer.
Yeah. And that's not video gaming. Yeah, it's not sitting there like competing, but it's actually having someone you can just, chit-chat about stupid things. But it's connection. Anything else? Or questions just about all of this? Yeah.
Just a question about how, now we've communed in this topic, where do we go from here in this place among ourselves and as a congregation, as a church, as a faith community?
Well, that's a bigger question, but I think to me the answer is, I'm going to come out of my experiences, because I work with a lot of pastors now who are struggling in their churches. Because I think if you look around the mainline church world, about 80% of our churches are in massive decline right now. I've been a pastor. I went to seminary in 1983. Between 1983 and 2022, we've lost we had 4 million members when I became a pastor. We now have about 1 million members. And I think a large part of this, to be honest, I did a workshop for the Mid-Atlantic Conference of the United Church of Christ this past week, and I'm doing one for the Clergy Day for the Diocese of Massachusetts up in Boston not this coming week, but the next week. And part of it is that is being aware that the people out there are saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. We need to hear the message. They think we're religious but not spiritual. And they're right. The key thing is, how do you as a community become more open to God's presence? Because I think what happens in a lot of mainline churches is, well, it's kind of what I said today. What I preached on, I talked about this stuff a lot when I was at Calvin Church, but for the most part, we don't talk about it. And what I didn't mention was how often I see Facebook posts by pastors I know who say, too many people are obsessed with what happens after they die. They need to be obsessed about how they're living now. And I think that's ridiculous. You're making it either or, and you're shaming people who actually think about, I think about dying all the time. I don't know if you all do, but we all do. So why are we somehow now saying that's not legitimate? It's being open to experiences, to conversations, to praying. When I first came to Calvin Church, the first thing I did was start to create prayer groups. I changed the way we did our session to creating more time for discernment, prayer. We got rid of reports to create more time. And when we voted, I would, especially if it's a significant issue, I would have us, take a minute and I would say, now in this time, I want you to let go of what you want. I want you to let go of what other people want. I want you now to start asking what God wants. And the question I would ask when the session would vote would be, all who sense this may be God's will for us, say aye. All who don't, say no. Because you know what we do in churches? When we vote, what do we say to vote for the vote in our churches mostly? All in favor? Say aye. All opposed? There's no God in that. I'm just asking what Diana's just voting on her own behalf. Basically, when you ask, there are a number of times at Calvin Church when we did that and somebody changed their vote during the prayer because they weren't asking what God wanted. Even had one situation where, I'm not going to explain, we were trying to move, the preschool had integrated with us, and so we needed an elder to go to the preschool. And our building and property person actually wanted to shift another elder to him because his committee, building and property committee, was kind of dying because it was just him. And he thought, I need another elder. And so we had this motion to move an elder from the Christian Education Committee to the preschool committee. Well, he convinced everybody to also move someone from the finance committee to the building and property committee. So we were about to vote. All 9 were, except Joe, were in favor of just doing the one thing. Joe convinced them all to vote the other way. So, okay, we've amended the motion, so it's moving a Christian ed person to preschool, a personnel and finance to building and property. Okay, we're going to take a minute to pray. So, all who sense this may be God's will for us, say aye. 8 people vote yes. All who don't, vote no. And one person, Joe, voted no. And I looked at him, I said, Joe, do you want to explain this? He goes, well, yeah. He said, before you asked that question, I was only focusing on what I wanted. He said, while I'm praying, I realized that I'm trying to get the session to take care of a Joe problem. I'm the one who's not going out and asking people to join the committee. He said, and I'm trying to make everybody else adjust around Joe. And he said, I'm now realizing that the original motion was what we needed to stick with. And we all started laughing, and I just looked at them all. I said, do we need to revote? And they went, no, we'll do the original one, just assume this was the vote. And it was a very funny moment, but just even simple things like that. It's being a community where we already know God's present, but we point to and allow it. So there's a esoteric answer up here. Susan knows how to do this stuff. That's, this is part of her background also. Part of when you're looking for someone as a pastor, do you open up to someone who's spiritual or just, something else? So, any other thoughts or questions?
You made me think when you mentioned the Facebook post and how we're either or. I think a lot of it is, I don't know if anybody follows Father Richard Rohr, but Yeah, I'm reading his book, and it's yes and, right? It's yes and.
Yeah.
Instead of
It was both and, yes and that's been the way spirituality has been forever. It's yeah, yeah, but it's hard because we live in an either-or culture, either Republican or Democrat. No, I'm an independent. There are parts of me that are conservative and parts of me that are progressive. I don't have a party. You're either male or female. You're either chronologically enhanced or you're young. However that works, but that's the way yeah. So, any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I'm wondering, you're probably familiar with the Stephen Ministry?
With the what ministry?
Stephen Ministry.
Yes.
And how,
The Stephen ministry, it's a more traditional ministry. What they're really doing is, it does fit but not. What they're really doing is training lay people to almost be like triage counselors. The difficulty is that often what happens is they put people through Stephen ministry training, but really what they want them to do is to just visit the homebound. And it's almost too much training because now you're going in looking for deep psychological problems. It's still a really good ministry. It's been around, since the very early 1980s. So it's good. It's really intensive, and sometimes it doesn't fit what people actually are looking for in a church.
Amen.
But it does spiritually integrate. So, any last question, and then we'll close, because nobody ever told me how long I was supposed to go or how short. So I don't know if I was actually doing TED Talks, which is only 18 minutes. So, but any other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I'm wondering, in the last year, I was diagnosed with anxiety. And I have this week someone say to me, well, are you praying about it?
Yeah, that's.
I thought, well, I'm working on strategies to manage it, right? And I do pray.
And praying's part of those strategies, but it's not the only.
That was
Yeah.
her point, but I was really offended.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that? Like
It is.
this is a chemical.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think it's the problem, what you were talking about, either or, is people like it's either faith or it's psychology or it's medicine or it's this. It's like, no, it's all of them. We did a lot of healing prayer at Calvin Church. But it's like, don't just come to us. You need to go see your doctors. You need to be on and that's the way, for example, at Samaritan we'll do counseling, we'll do the strategies for anxiety. We can integrate the prayer into it, but also you do need to see your PCP or a psychiatrist to be on medication. These are people who don't mean to be offensive. They think what they're doing is helpful, but they're also making an assumption that they know what's lacking in your life, when in fact they really don't.
But what would be a good response then with a comment like that?
Thank you very much.
Prayer,
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your interest in me. Don't engage it. I know. Just don't engage it. I know they want to, but just don't, because what happens is, what I've learned is there's nothing you're going to say. If you really want to change it, is you can say, I am praying. And when you do that, it actually puts a wall between you and me, because you're making the assumption that I don't. And we're supposed to be friends, where you're supposed to be compassionate towards my situation. Something along those lines, which what you're doing is establishing your own boundaries in that case. So, anything else?
It should be noted, I think, Ray, that you're brave to bring that up. Thank you.
Yeah. Now I feel shame because I should have said that instead of you. I'm sorry, Dawn.
he makes a good sidekick.
Yeah. You're going to have to follow around wherever I go. Let me close this with a prayer. Gracious and holy God, thank you for this time, and thank you for everyone's interest. I pray, Lord, that you would be a presence and a blessing on everyone, so that we can not just experience your presence, but experience your life that brings balance to our lives, so that we also can be people who make a difference in others. And Lord, we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Do you have one real quick thought? What's your name?
Ray.
Ray. There is one other way of looking at it. You're going through a really difficult experience. From a spiritual perspective, it also allows you to tap into your own experience to enhance your own compassion. Not that you're not compassionate. That's not what I'm saying. But I think there is something where when you're going through that and you have comments that come to you, use them as a resource to also help you transcend whatever's going on, which also will help your anxiety. That you know, I have a woman that I've been doing spiritual direction for 12 years, and she has all sorts of physical issues, and a large part of what we talk about is how do you turn, you know, your autoimmune issues into a way of helping others. And what she's found is she's now become the wise guide for her family and for people in her church, but they have to come seek her out rather than her going places because she's in a lot of pain, but she taps into that pain and uses it as a resource of compassion. So I don't want to reduce what you're doing to that, but it is saying there is a tiny gift in there that can also be used. So anyway, should have thought about that before I prayed, but so I'll say another prayer. Blessings on all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Graham, thank you very much.
Thank you.